Hi everyone, and welcome to this basic introduction into the dice system in the Star Wars role-playing game made by Fantasy Flight Games. As many of you know, by the time this video has been created, Fantasy Flight Games is actually going to be going out of business, but I wanted to provide this guide for individuals who still wanted to play the game in the future. So we're going to be going through each of the dice, talking about kind of their implications, what they mean as far as narrative in the game, and just different combinations of uses for the dice and the dice pool. So there are, again, several types of dice. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 types of dice that you can use in this game. And all of them can basically be used together to create a dice pool, which you can use in order to create combat checks. You can also use them to roll for certain skills in the game. And we're going to kind of go over situations you might, use the dice for, and kind of how they, can be added into, a certain pool. So the first dice that we'll go over is this green dice here, or green die. This is an ability dice, and it is kind of the first die that you will be using if you are rolling a skill or a combat check for your character. There are several symbols you'll notice on the dice that you can come up with, and I guess it's good to point out, so we have the ability dice, the proficiency dice, we have the difficulty dice and challenge dice, and then this is a boost dice and setback dice, and then this is the force dice, which we'll get into. And so these two dice are helpful for you. These are the dice that you want to be using as a character, and so they have several symbols. So this dice has two different symbols. The first are these kind of explosions, and these represent success. So when you're rolling for a skill or a combat check, you want a certain number of successes in order for the skill to succeed. And then this symbol here is what's known as an advantage symbol, and this is a symbol that you can use. It's basically for narrative purposes, and we'll kind of go into what that means, but basically you're rolling successes against failures and then advantages versus disadvantages. Now if we move on to the proficiency dice, we have similar symbols. We also have success symbols, and then we also have, we have blank spots. We also have advantages. You'll notice there is one symbol that is different. This is a triumph, and this is just a very, very good success, basically, which can give you, certain really strong abilities when you roll it. So we're going to the triumphs. So these are the good dice. These are the dice you want to be using. And we also have the challenge dice. And as I mentioned, there are success symbols. These are failure symbols, the triangles. And then these are known as threats or advantages. So you're rolling the failures against the successes, and then the threats or disadvantages against your advantages. So the goal is, obviously, to roll these two types of dice against these, and you want to get more successes and advantages over disadvantages and failures. So moving on to, this is the challenge dice, and so we have, again, we have the failure symbols, we have the threats or disadvantages, and then we also have this symbol, which is known as a despair. And so it's basically the opposite of a triumph. It is when something really terrible and bad happens to you in a roll. So that's basically how the dice work. If you think of it, the green and the purple dice are almost foils of each other. They're exact opposites. And the same with the proficiency and the challenge dice. They are almost exact opposites. So that's the main dice pool. And then, of course, we have, again, boost dice, which is filled with similar symbols, but you'll notice there are a lot of blanks on here. There's not as many symbols. And these are kind of situational dice that you use. Can be either from an ability you have, a talent you have. It could be something that the GM decides that you get as a player, and it will increase your odds of succeeding or getting advantages in a roll. And then again, the foil of that is called a setback dice. And so this could be situations that would cause you to add one of these that makes a roll harder for you. So we'll go into kind of when those dice are applied and why they might be applied. And then finally we have the force die, which can be used for a couple different applications, two to be exact. So the force dice represents different aspect of the force. So these kind of empty circles, or just the outlines of circles, they represent the light side of the force. And then the dark filled in circles, they represent the dark side of the force. And so if you are a force user in this system, you can use these in order to activate certain force abilities that you can use. And we won't go into character creation or the force in this video too in depth, but you can use this in order to kind of activate certain things. And the other kind of application for this is everyone rolls one of these at the beginning of the game, which can create basically a communal dice pool for the entire session. And it really has an interesting kind of application, and that is there are light side points that you can use as a group, and then there are dark side points that the GM can use. And it's kind of like a Deus Ex Machina type of mechanic. For instance, a group can use an available light side point that they have in their pool in order to make something go well for them. Let's say they are in combat and they are trying to open a door, maybe a spark kind of flies and something magical happens, the door opens. So you can use these in order to kind of make things go your way, as long as the GM allows whatever you're saying. You can also, let's say you're rolling some green dice in a pool, you can use the force. Maybe you want to upgrade one to a yellow. That's totally fine. And then kind of the opposite of that, the GM can use the dark side points in order to hurt the group. They can they can make a situation go bad for them. They can make something maybe harder to find if they're looking for something and it's harder for them to find. They can also kind of, again, the opposite of the yellow, they can upgrade maybe an enemy, one of their dice, to a red dice. So they're, that's kind of how you use the force. And so at the beginning of the game, everyone rolls, you get a certain dice pool. It's usually, around 6, 7, could be 5, points, and it flips back and forth. So whenever, let's say, a group member uses a light side point, that then gets flipped to a dark side. And so now the GM has an extra point, and then, conversely, if the GM uses a dark side point, it gets flipped to a light side point. So that is the dice. Now let's go into kind of situations you might be using the dice for and what their applications are. So I think the best way in order to do that is to bring in a character sheet. And if you haven't looked at the character sheet, you can access these online. I can also put a link in the description for one. So we're not going to go through the sheet specifically, but there are these skills, right, that you can use for your character. And you will assemble a dice pool in order to roll one of these skills in whatever situation you might be in. It could be something that the GM decides that you roll for, or it could be something that you choose to roll for, depending on what the narrative is. And then also, you have your combat skills, which are up here, and you can also roll for these with your dice. So we'll go into kind of a situation. So in order to describe how to assemble a dice pool, we have to put ranks into our skills, and we also have to put some numbers up here. So let's do that. I'm going to do that really quickly. Move this over. And then 1 second here. Okay, so this is just kind of an example. So what I've done is I filled in some numbers for the characteristics up here, and these characteristics are kind of the base numbers for your character. So we have, I don't even know if this will show up very well, but we have brawn, there we go. We have agility, intellect, we have cunning, willpower, and presence. These are characteristics that you can have for your character, and of course the higher the number, the more dice that you'll get for your pool. And they all also apply to these skills. So you can see for each skill there is a characteristic in parentheses, and so that's what each skill is kind of garnered by as far as the characteristic that they need to use for it. So for instance, I have filled in 2 ranks for deception. You can see cunning is the characteristic that is applied to it. So we'll go through kind of that dice pool and how you would put it together. So we have deception here, cunning, we have 2 ranks, and then we also have 4 in cunning. And then similarly for the combat skills, we have ranged heavy, which is agility, we have 2 ranks in that. And I also put 2 in brawl, which is brawn, up here. And then I did some knowledge underworld, which is intelligence, and we have, intellect, we have 2 intellect. So let's go over this deception one first. So the way the dice work is you need to build a pool of green dice first, and at least when you're kind of learning. So the way you do this is you, out of the 2 skills, so we have deception and cunning, out of either the skill or the characteristic, you need to pick whatever the bigger number is. Whatever number is bigger, you pick that number. So the bigger number is 4. So we have 2 in deception, 4 in cunning. So we have 4 dice. That's going to be our total pool. All right, so we have 4 green dice. All right, that's how we start. All right, so that's the first number is our total dice pool. Now the second number, which is 2 for deception, is how many of those dice are going to be upgraded to yellow dice. And so we have 2. That means 2 of these are now yellow dice. And then we have our pool. Well, the beginning of our pool. So that is how we create a skill with the characteristic. All right. So once again, you take the bigger number first, that is your total dice, and you start out with green, and then you can upgrade them to yellow depending on if you have ranks in the skill that you're trying to roll for. So situation, let's say you are buying something from a buyer, and you tell them that you have more credits than you do have. Or maybe you don't have that many credits and you are telling them that you're going to get more, right? So you're deceiving them, promising them to pay more if you give them less credits now to buy something, and perhaps maybe get away with it. So you're, whatever deception you might use. You could also deceive some stormtroopers, okay? Now, in order to complete the dice pool, you will need some difficulty dice and or some challenge dice. Now, this is generally something that the GM will work with you on. There are also some standards for it, especially in combat. So this is where it gets a little bit different, but in combat there are the main way you do it is by range. So for instance, there are certain ranges for combat. There is engaged, there is short, medium, long, and extreme. If you are engaged or in short, it will usually be 1 difficulty dice that you start out with. If you are in medium, it should be 2 difficulty dice. If you are in long range, it should be 3, and if you are in extreme range, it will be 4. Now this is easy, average, sorry. 1 is easy, 2 is average, 3 is hard, 4 is formidable, and 5 is daunting. Now, formidable and daunting are fairly rare. You will not usually fire a weapon at extreme range, unless you have a really good weapon that can do that. But generally, this is the most you're going to do, just from experience. So that's combat, kind of starting out. If you are in a situation where you are doing deception, this is up to the discretion of the GM pretty much. And this is after, looking through the rule book, looking for different, kind of pieces of information about how this works. Generally speaking, the GM will tell you what the difficulty will be, and this is just based off their knowledge of whatever character maybe you're trying to deceive, maybe what the situation is, things like that. So let's say you are talking to someone you're deceiving them into giving you an item for less money and promising them that you will come back with more later. Let's say you're talking to a really, unintelligent Trandoshan. All right, so then the GM might decide it's an easy check. Okay, let's say instead you are trying to deceive a moth, an Imperial moth. It's going to be harder. Maybe they're maybe they're a little bit smarter. Intellect is a little bit smarter, so they're going to be harder to deceive, or maybe their cunning is higher, something like that. So the GM, you're kind of at the mercy of the GM there. Hopefully your GM will, be understanding and not, make certain roles unfair. But I would say, and I've, GM'd some games, not too many, but I would say in general, I think average is just a good fallback if you're a GM, or if you're just trying to figure out, what a role might be. There's nothing wrong with putting something to the average roll. Now, looking at this, you might say, okay, we have 2 really good dice, 2, pretty good green dice against 2 purples. There's no way that this roll, could go wrong. But that is completely incorrect. The dice will not work in your favor many times when you have this type of pool. These, you'll be surprised. Of course, if you have 2 ranks in something, that is going to be very strong. It's going to help you out a lot. But if you have 2 greens instead, then it's going to be a lot harder, But nevertheless, this is our basic dice pool for this deception roll we've just set up. So what we can do, let's say we're talking to an average NPC. You're trying to deceive them. It's not going to be the hardest thing in the world, but it's also not, this person isn't completely dumb. So we'll just do a roll. See what happens. So the way we read this is we have to compare. And if you've played like Risk or anything like that, it's very similar. You're just comparing the number of things to other things. So we have a blank one that gives us nothing, put out of the way. We have 2 success. We have another success right here, as well as an advantage. Okay, so we have 3 success. We also have 1 advantage, 2 advantage, and then we have 1, 2, 3 threats or disadvantages. I don't know if you can see that. So how do we read this? So we have 3 disadvantages and 3 advantages. That means they cancel out. You have 0, no advantage, but you do have 3 successes. So this roll succeeded, and it succeeded very well. So that's good, and you have no advantages, which, is not fine. And we can go over advantage and disadvantage kind of narratively, which is, what we can go into after this. Basically, you succeed with this. So you deceive the person, they give you the item for a lower amount, and you get away. Nothing else happens. There's no other advantage. Let's say you did have, let's say one of these purples was blank. Now you have 3 advantages and 2 disadvantages. That means you have 1 advantage. So you get something extra. Now this can be, there are rules for this, and let me just kind of go over those. So some advantages you can have, and these are mainly for combat. If you have 1 advantage, you can recover a strain. You can also add a blue to a check, let's say a future check, a boost dice you can apply to your check or an ally. You can also notice something that is important. It could be in the store, could be something in the battlefield, something like that. And then you can also activate a weapon quality. So again, this is going to combat, going in a little bit more specific than I want to, but certain weapons have abilities, kind of things that you can use an advantage to activate that. Let's say you get 2 advantages. Alright, so let's say that one's blank. So you have 2, I'm sorry, you would have 3 here. Let's do 1 disadvantage. If you had 2 disadvantages, you could use a free maneuver. Now, that's, again, a topic for another video, but you could use something extra in a turn. You could also add a black dice to an enemy's next roll. Let's say they try to roll something else afterwards. You can make them do a setback dice, okay? Or again, you could add more boost dice. If you have 3 advantages, so now we have, if we're at 0, okay? So now this roll has 3 advantages. You can remove defense values. So if that's, again, going into more specifics, you can ignore environmental effects. So let's say you just rolled something and you're in a you're on a planet that has either rough terrain or let's say has a harsh environment. You can remove those effects for a little bit of a small amount of time. You can also disable someone's gear instead of damage. Let's say you shoot them, you would instead want to disable their gear. You can also gain 1 melee range defense, or you can force a target to go prone, which means to kind of go in a crouch position. So these are more combat focused, but really when you're doing skill checks, so for like deception, you want to use these advantages in order to get situational effects. So let's say you got 3 advantages. You could potentially, if let's say after this roll, since you just deceived this person, let's say if you wanted to steal something, which would probably be skullduggery, that's the skill that you would use, you could have a bunch of maybe 2 boost dice on that, because this person is kind of, you know, maybe in a weird mood or something like that, they're not paying attention, you could steal something more easily. So you can just, you know, make it up, it's narrative, and usually the player will come up with something and the GM just has to approve it or disapprove it. So hopefully that makes sense, and combat works very similarly. Again, it's just range, and the only difference with combat is the amount of successes that you get will affect your damage. So you need at least 1 success in order for a weapon that you're using to hit, to, you know, be successful. However, for every extra success you get, you can add 1 extra damage to whatever that weapon, whatever that damage is. So that's combat a little bit. Not going too much into that, and hopefully the pool is making more sense. Now let's go into our the boost dice and the setback dice. All right. Now, in general, I've also, of all the dice that I've included here, get the force dice out. This, you should almost never need more than this for a single roll. In fact, these are way more than you would normally need for a roll. So, if you're a player and you're not sure how many dice you need, this is like the max, I would say. And yeah, so we'll go into the boost dice. And actually, before we do that, I just want to talk about challenge dice. So challenge dice are almost always decided by the GM. Unless there may be an enemy, an NPC who has an ability that might upgrade a dice to red, but this is generally the GM, and it's for very difficult situations. It's really up to their discretion. So if they are in a situation where something really could go wrong, let's say you're making a mechanics check on like an astro droid or something like that, you know, and you want it to be a really difficult check as a GM, you can upgrade a purple dice to a red one, and that means that it's going to be more difficult. And if they roll this, something, let's say the droid is permanently damaged now if you roll that. So that's kind of the red dice. They aren't used as much, at least I don't use them as much, but you can use them as a GM. And I think another good thing about the red dice is as your players get more experience, as they get better, as they start, killing enemies more easily, you can use the red dice to your advantage if you want, in order to make the difficulty of combat more difficult. You can start using more. That's kind of my input on the red dice. And now for the boost dice and the setback dice. So as I said, you can use these kind of whenever you feel the situation requires it, but you can also spend advantages and disadvantages on that if you want to. So I think a good example of this is, so you do have maneuvers when you're in combat, and you can use a maneuver to aim your weapon, and aiming a weapon will basically give you one of these in order to make the likelihood of your combat check to be successful. You'll do this. It is good to note that there are, I think, 2 blank spots, and there's only 1, so it's not like it's going to add too much, but it is helpful to have these. Another good situation, let's say you're on a planet and it's a very sunny day. If you want to do a perception check to look around, let's say the GM might decide you get a blue dice because you can see really well. Once again, if we go back to that deception roll that I talked about earlier, if you successfully deceive them and you get an advantage or 2 advantage, I would say 2 advantage for many of these, because you don't want to throw these out too much. Then you could then add a blue dice to, let's say, a skullduggery or a stealth check if you're trying to steal something later on. So there are many applications for these, and it's kind of, sometimes the GM will decide if you get a blue dice, sometimes the player. And then the same for these. Let's say you're on a planet that is very polluted. The GM might decide that all your perception checks will add a black dice. Let's say you're picking a difficult lock, or you're trying to use a scramble key, which you can use to unlock something, against a very difficult lock. The GM might decide you need one of these because of how difficult it is. And same in a situation, let's say you roll for a skill, you get disadvantages, the GM might decide to add one of these to your roll. So let's create one final pool. So that deception check passed, and let's say we had those advantages we talked about, and we used the advantage to, let's say we had 3 advantages, and we used them to add a blue dice to our roll. So, and we're going to be doing a skullduggery roll, okay? So let's look at our sheet. I didn't add any ranks in there, but we have, it's cunning and no ranks in skullduggery. So we start with the bigger number. So we have 0 and 4. The bigger number is 4. All right, that's our base pool right there. And then from that advantage we had, we add the blue dice. That's our dice. Now for the difficulty, let's say it is an item that is medium sized, so it's average, and it's far enough away from the person at the store who owns the store that maybe they can't see it in plain sight. Let's say you're in short range of each other, but it's not close enough that they would clearly see what you're doing. We'll say it's an average roll as a GM. Again, that's up to kind of their discretion for these types of things. Let's say the item that you are trying to steal is it is made of metal, and when you pick it up, it clings or it makes a noise. All right, so whatever it is, whatever the item is, it makes noise. So that means you get a setback dice. I'm just trying to use this as an example. So the GM might decide, because this item makes noise when you touch it, you now have a setback dice. Alright? So we have our basic pool here. So really we have these 3 are kind of the negative ones, these 5 are the positive ones. So let's roll, and I think that's all we have. So, alright, now let's see what we have. So right away you can see you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 successes. Okay. 1 failure right here. So it succeeds. We'll just say that. However, you have 2 disadvantages and 2 advantages. So those cancel out. So you have 7 successes. That's what we got from that roll. It's a very good roll. So not only does it, well, the thing is with these types of checks is the extra successes may not give you anything. It might just succeed. So, you know, it's not like you can use the advantage to kind of get something else out of the situation. Usually these are just meant for combat to get extra successes. So in this situation, it is up to you and the players. You know, the rules are in place, but you might, let's say, because there are so many successes, you do want to give the player something, you can do that. But if you want to kind of stay strictly to the rules, you could say, all right, it succeeds, you steal it, that's it, and you're good. So it's kind of up to your discretion. And yeah, that's kind of it. Again, with the force dice, the last one that I had mentioned, there isn't too much to go into it. If you are a force user and you're trying to use a force power, you will roll it, and it will affect you as a player. So let's say you are a light side user, and you want to get some force points in order to spend some abilities, and depending on the types of abilities you are, you might need to spend a certain amount. So, for instance, if you want to move a big object, you have to use a talent tree in order to get certain abilities in order to do that. And each ability that brings you to that ability to move a very large object will cost a certain amount of destiny points, they're called, or force points. So if you're, let's say, if you are a force level 1 user, you only get 1 dice. However, if you finish a tree, you can then move up to force 2. So that means you'll get 2 of these that you can roll. And that might, so if let's say you want to move a big object and let's say it costs 4 destiny points, you will need at least 2 dice, at least, in order to use that ability. So it kind of makes it so you know you can't use whatever force ability you want early on. You have to be strong in the force in order to do certain things. Hopefully that makes sense. So if you roll this and you get, again, the 2 light side, and you're a light side user, that's great. You can now use the points and it's in your favor. However, let's say you roll and you are a light side user and you get 2 dark side points. That now means that you can use these points, but it will have an effect on you. It will have a negative effect. It'll challenge you as a force user. It will force you to take 1 strain per point, so you will take 2 strain if you use both of these. And then also narratively, you as a player need to kind of describe or figure out how your player will be challenged by the dark side, which is kind of a fun narrative tool in the game. So I guess as an example, you are let's say you are trying to move a very small object, and you get the dark side points, and you feel like a disturbance in the force, and it kind of upsets you, and then let's say that night you have a nightmare, and now you're kind of pushed closer to the dark side. It doesn't have to be anything huge. It could be something very small, but it's kind of your way of telling your character's story, and maybe let's say as you move along, you're getting more and more of these dark side points. Your character could be moving closer to the dark side, and maybe eventually you decide that the character wants to turn to the dark side. You can do stuff like that. So it's just a fun narrative tool, I think, and that is pretty much it. So that is what I have for this basic intro. Hopefully that was helpful. I probably will make more of these, but thank you all for watching, and we'll see you soon.